Hi, I'm Josh Altick, the Director of Research at Ballotpedia, and I'm here with Alicia Searcy. Alicia has a wealth of experience from serving in the Georgia legislature to being a superintendent, working with nonprofits. Her wealth of education background is impressive. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Josh. Happy to be here.
Can you please start by telling us a little bit about your background in education and how you came to your vast education perspective?
Sure. I think it's probably a good idea to start with my own educational experience. I'm a public school graduate. I grew up in Florida, and I'm also a product of public school choice. My parents, my mom in particular, was very interested in making sure that my brother and I went to schools that met our needs, and they weren't necessarily all the time the ones that were in our neighborhood. But I, in particular, was interested in the arts. And so my middle school, high school experiences were very focused on the performing arts and attending a magnet school. And so that's how it started. And it wasn't until I was elected in the legislature several years later, after my K-12 experience and moving to Georgia and coming to Georgia to attend Spelman College and graduated. And shortly after I graduated from college, I went to Spelman College. I moved to Cobb County and ran for state representative at a pretty young age. And so when I got elected, and even before that, as I was involved in my community, education kept coming up as the primary issue. And it wasn't something that was always at the foremost of my mind, but it was something that I've always been passionate about and cared about. But in my particular district, it was the primary issue. And so I dove in and really started focusing on education. And so when I was elected, I spent most of my time working on public education issues, whether it was public school choice, teacher effectiveness, closing the achievement gap. Those were the kinds of things that I was working on. And I would like to say that when it comes to the public school choice issue, it found me. It got pretty political, and we may or may not get into that topic, but that is my journey of how I worked on these issues, became deeply passionate, spent a lot of time in schools as a legislator, really learning from educators and talking to parents in my district. And I also had a program on Saturdays called Saturday with My State Rep. And I spent that time with young people, training them and giving them tools in terms of soft skills like public speaking and how to write a resume. But it was also an opportunity for me to learn what was happening in schools. And so after I left the legislature in 2014, I went through a very intense superintendent training program. So I skipped a few steps, was never a classroom teacher, but went straight in as a superintendent and ran a network of public charter schools. And what an incredible experience that was to go from being a policymaker to a practitioner. And I learned some pretty interesting lessons about the importance of practitioners being in policymaking, understanding how it all works. Some of the things we did in law were great. Some of them not so much when I was a practitioner. And so all of that journey, again, got a chance to connect with people, constituents, educators, young people, parents, and just make sure that I'm doing everything I can to improve our educational system and make sure that regardless of a kid's zip code or background, that they have access to that high quality public education.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. So in your experience talking with parents and talking with families and thinking about policy, tell us a little bit about how school choice policy affects rural school districts and why. I think a lot of the narrative we're seeing right now is that, well, it's just simply the case that there isn't choice at the rural level, that there really isn't a way to cater an education to an individual need. So tell us a little bit about your experience with that. And, is that the case? And if not, what types of school choice policies can be available and can be made effective at the rural level where, you do have a community often built around a public school district, and you have long commute times, and transportation is issue, and all those things that affect those rural areas that aren't an issue in the big urban cities.
Yeah, I think you point out really the biggest challenges in rural areas. Now, of course, I've represented Metro Atlanta most of my time, so I won't, pretend to be the expert. But certainly, given the work that I've done over the years, it's very clear to me that there are some very challenging issues when it comes to rural communities, rural parents, and students having access to choices. And you mentioned some of those things. Transportation is a huge issue. A lot of the communities are very spread out, and so the cost of transportation is more expensive. You don't have as many schools. There are many schools in rural areas where you might have the elementary, middle, and high school all in one complex. You might have just one elementary, one middle school, one high school for an entire school district. And then you also have to think about the talent. If you're in a smaller area that doesn't have, the same things as an urban or suburban area might have, you may not be able to have the number of people, right? The skilled talent to teach, to lead, to manage schools. And so those are some of the challenges that rural communities are faced with, in addition to property tax issues, right? And so as an example, in Georgia, a lot of our more metro or urban districts are kind of offsetting some of the funding for rural districts because they don't have the tax base to pay into the system. And in many of our states, federal funds are less than 10% of the overall education budget. A large portion of it is usually those local tax dollars that people are paying in terms of property tax or however they may set it up for the state. And so when you think about rural communities, sometimes they don't have the tax base and then therefore don't have the resources to have a number of schools, again, teachers, those kinds of things. And so when you talk about choice, there are way too many rural communities that just don't have choice. Because again, you have one elementary, one middle school, one high school in a community. And so if that's all you have, where are you going to go? Unless you're going to a different county or a different district. And again, that's a transportation issue. And so it's a real concern. But I will say that from a virtual perspective, we do have opportunities to bring more options to rural areas. And that's an area that we probably should explore a lot more. I also think that just because we have those current challenges in rural areas does not mean that we have to leave it that way. I think where options are available, parents will take advantage of them. I think kids in rural areas deserve to have access to options. One size does not fit all. And I have 3 school-age children, my husband and I, one that's graduating from high school this year. Yay. And the other 2, thank you. The other 2 are elementary and middle school. They're very different kids who need different things. And so I cannot imagine how challenging it must be for families to have no choices at all. And so I would advocate that it's important that even though rural areas have these challenges, that they can still be overcome and that those parents and families deserve to have options.
Yeah, I think that's right. You've been, such a vocal champion of parental choice and giving families options for customized education, especially within the public school education, whether it's with charter schools or magnet schools or programs that work within the public school system. Right now, especially in Republican states, but all over the country, there's a lot of discussion about how education fits between the public school system and private schools. And especially in red states, there's been a lot of discussion about programs like education savings accounts and vouchers. Mm-hmm. So in some cases, those programs have been passed and they're being implemented. So that policy is kind of inevitable. How would you say, how would you say that you'd recommend policymakers approach that issue in a way that caters to rural school districts and rural areas? Is there a way to make those programs, since they're coming into place, is there a way to make them benefit rural areas as well as just the larger populations?
So that's a tough one for me. And I will just start by saying, I'm a proponent of public school choice, not a proponent of private school choice. Not because I don't think parents should have options. I believe that as a parent, you know what's best for your child. You know that if you want, whether it's a Catholic based education or some other environment where you want to put them in a private school, I think you should have the option to do that. As it stands, I think you're going to also have to have the resources to do that. The challenge that I have with vouchers and ESAs is that, number one, they often lack accountability. But even when we talk about resources, and I think this is certainly the case in rural areas, if you talk about having one elementary, one middle, one high school, you probably don't have any private schools. And if you do, there's a certain history that I can, touch on a little bit later with private schools, particularly in the South, that it's a whole different animal. And so the challenge here, and let me also say, as a parent, again, I think parents should have options. As a matter of public policy and as a former policy maker, I am challenged with ESAs and vouchers because, number one, we're not going to be able to pay for those, the tuition for many of the schools that families would have access to, if they have access at all. We have challenges with accountability. It's not going to do anything to improve what's happening in public education. And so we have a lot of challenges there. But to get to your question about how, if it's possible to make these programs work in rural areas, I think it starts with having options. And so people who want to have schools, who've always been educators, they've always wanted to start a school, or they want to have opportunities for their children or their families. This might be the vehicle to do that. One of the things that I think is also important to consider, there's traditional public schools, there's options within the public school system, as you mentioned, charter schools, magnets, you've got intra-district transferring and all different options in that regard. Then we have private school, and sometimes we think of these, very affluent, very expensive private schools, but there's something in the middle, and that's micro schools. And that's something that, in a rural area, that's probably a very good option. That's somewhere in the middle where parents still have options. You're in a smaller environment. You may have this amazing teacher or set of teachers who has a much smaller class size. We're talking 5, 10 kids, and they are providing an educational opportunity for a number of students. And so that's one option that I think, if you're talking about how do you make ESAs or vouchers work, they're coming, you're right. Mm-hmm. And while I have been in opposition in terms of from a policy standpoint, they're coming to the communities. What can you do? I think micro schools would be a reasonable option. Some people are into homeschooling. That's another option. And so there are some of the laws in states where you can use the dollars that are allocated for quote unquote vouchers or ESAs. The dollars can be used for charter schools. The dollars can be used for tutoring, They could also be used for micro schools. And so I think that may be a viable option. It's smaller, doesn't require, significant resources in terms of facilities and other sort of high expenses on the back end. There may be other ways that educators can create educational opportunities for families who want that option as well.
Interesting, yeah. In your conversations, would you say that, especially with the public schools, what are the main concerns of the public school districts in these rural areas about how private school choice options like ESAs and vouchers might affect their enrollment or might affect their funding? What are the biggest concerns you're hearing from the public school districts and the public school families?
Great question. And it's we don't ask that question enough. We don't think about, when we're talking about these states, Georgia, Texas, wherever, we don't think enough about these rural communities and how they are affected. And as I mentioned, many of these school districts rely on state funding. Hmm. And so if you have a voucher that's giving, let's say, $10,000 just for a round number, per child, and the per pupil funding in a district could be $8,000 or $10,000. So if you're taking, children away from that district, that means that the money is following them to that private school. And so in a district where you only have one elementary school, if you take 100 kids out of that school, and that's in the school, you could completely bankrupt a school system because they do not have the resources to serve the students that remain. And so again, while we respect that parents want options, we want kids to have access to options outside of their zone school, for these very small and rural districts that don't have a lot of resources, that could mean they won't have teachers. That could mean they won't have transportation. That could mean that they'll have a real hard time buying the curriculum and other resources that they may need to deliver instruction to students. And so it's a real challenge. It's a real issue that rural districts have to face. And so it's frightening for them, because if you're saying, I'm going to take half of your state funding because these kids are leaving the district, there are some of us in education who talk about, the money belongs to the family, and that is true. But in a situation like this, where they desperately need those dollars just to operate a school, it's the community's money and it's the money of that particular family. And so you really have to be thoughtful about how you create vouchers and ESAs and how they're going to affect districts that are essentially low wealth and don't have the resources and could really be harmed significantly by the loss of those resources.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things we're fascinated by as we track all of these policies kind of moving through the legislatures and getting enacted is the variety we see. And I think in some states, rural legislators, especially on the Republican side, kind of feel like they have a voice on this issue that they don't often have. And we've seen that in states like North Dakota, where their school choice bill went down and wasn't passed this cycle over the governor's veto, and in other states like Kentucky, yeah. where the policy proposals are getting very innovative. So I'm curious about your take. I'll give you a few examples. Some of the interesting ones we've seen are guaranteeing per pupil funding doesn't go away. So you keep protecting state funding in spite of any sort of enrollment loss for public schools. We've seen it paired, like in Texas, with bonuses for public school teachers, like a one-time bonus, just to try and make it more appetizing. We've seen things like, legislators' children don't qualify, so it's not just a giveaway to state officials. And we've even seen in North Dakota, the governor advocate for a school choice system that does give funding, but to all students across the public and private sector. So you would have a certain amount, a smaller amount going to public school children for things like tutoring or supplies or transportation, and then a larger amount going to private school students to cover that tuition cost. And then you'd have an amount for homeschool students or migrants. So very interesting reform proposals out there that are starting to represent, I think, the rural concerns. So I guess you mentioned accountability, you mentioned transportation. What would be your, top 3 favorite details to include if you're going to have a program like this? What are the top 3 details you would recommend to make the program work for everyone, even though it's a compromise, but work for everyone in a sense of not causing damage and being accessible?
Great question. I think number 1 is the funding piece. So if you're going to, if I'm creating the model policy, even though it probably would never pass, these would be my answers. Number 1, for every dollar that's given to a private school, it gets matched in the public education system. So in other words, districts would not lose dollars because a child left their system. Now, let me say this, because I know a lot about metro school districts, and many of them are not hurting for money. And so I would also make sure that if they were getting those extra dollars, because essentially that is what they'd be doing, because they're getting resources for kids that are not there, I would attach some accountability to it. They'd have some restrictions in how they spent those extra dollars. That would have to be to benefit of the kids who are still in their system. The second thing that I would do is I would create where it would the school that was chosen, the private school that was chosen, would have to be fully funded for the child. So in other words, if I choose to go to X, Y, and Z elementary school or Catholic school that's private, even if the tuition is $17,000 a year, the state covers that entire amount. Or if you're going to be one of the receiving schools, you have to have a tuition that is the same amount of the voucher. And again, I say this because for so many families who I wish could have access to a private school education, if that's what they desire, they'll never be able to get it. Because even where there are options of private school, the tuition is way out of reach. So just getting, for example, in Georgia, a $6,500 voucher for a school that has a $30,000 price tag, it'll never happen.
That's fascinating. I love that idea, because one of the concerns I've heard as well is that you're just going to, you give an extra several $1,000s to private school students, you're just going to see the private school tuition go up because that money is available. And so if you're not increasing supply, but increasing demand, then you're going to see it. So that's fascinating. I haven't heard anyone say it like that before. So very interesting.
Yeah. And then the third one is no discrimination. The thing about private schools, they're private. So they don't have to follow many of the federal and state laws. So when you talk about students with disabilities, or a student who comes with perhaps a behavior record, or a student who may be of a different religion or a different race, maybe a different sexual orientation than they are used to having, private schools have the ability to discriminate. And so that would be the third, and I think one of the most important policies that I would add is that if you are one of the schools that's receiving students, you need to agree that you will not discriminate on any basis. Because again, this should be parent driven. And so those would be the three policies. They're about funding and equity, and they're making sure that everyone has access to those schools and cannot be discriminated against.
That's fantastic. I love that answer a lot. My last question is kind of what you just said, kind of leads right into it, is I want to hear a little more about your mental model in terms of how the parent choice, whether in the public school system or across education more broadly, how does that how do you see that in terms of competition? Everyone in the education space should be working toward one goal, the good education of children, right? The really quality education of children, all children. But there's an idea that the more competition, the better. And that's one of the arguments for choice, both for public school choice and private school choice. So does that play a role in your thinking on choice? Is there a way that some healthy competition could improve quality, or is that a detrimental or the wrong way to think about it? What's your perspective on what role competition plays in the choice policy when it comes to education?
It's an interesting question. I think that there is a role, but I don't think it's, for me, a significant role. I believe in general in, free market principles. And I understand that whatever system you have, if there's competition, naturally people will do their best because they want to be chosen. And so I think inherently the public school system, if they had more competition, would try to do better. I do think that there are times within the system, and I say this as a former superintendent, that you have all of these systems and processes that you have to follow. There's a lot of constraints within public education. And sometimes you can get bogged down in that and forget about who you're there to serve. And so I think if there's some competition there, if I'm saying, and in the case for me, I ran a network of public charter schools, parents were choosing to come to our schools. And I had to make sure that our schools were better than the ones that they were leaving, or that they were better than the ones that they also could choose from in terms of other charters or private schools or any other options that they had in the metro Atlanta area. So yes, there was this, I want us to be the best. I want to make sure that we've got the best test scores, that we're providing, a holistic education. It was an all girls network of schools. So it was an incredible opportunity in that regard. So I think that there's some value in inserting competition. I think in districts that I've seen across the country, when there are charter schools that come, when there are contract schools, when parents have opportunities, I do hear principals say, well, I need to keep our kids in this building. So what do I need to do? If they have a after school program, we need to get that. If they have STEM, we need to get STEM. And so I do think having that ability to compare, to compete, to say, I want to be better than them, helps us to create a system where all kids win, no matter where they go to school.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, those are all the questions I had for you. It was just wonderful to hear that perspective. Is there anything else you'd like to say kind of on this issue or education more broadly before we wrap up?
I think I'll just say this, that we can acknowledge that our public education system needs a lot of help. We need to not only invest in it, and I don't mean just throw more dollars, but we need to improve our education system so that it really works for all kids. And I know that there are challenges. You know, you talk to teachers and they are overwhelmed, they're underpaid, all of the things. And we need to begin to pay attention to what they're saying and do something about the challenges that they're facing. I also think, though, that we're in an interesting time where we're talking about choice and competition and private versus public and all of the things. It should make us within the public education system also want to make some, not just improvements, but transformation. I've often said, Josh, that, school looks exactly like it did when I was in school. I've been out of college 25 years. So you do the math, almost 30 years ago, I was in school, and it very much looks the same as my daughter's school as she's graduating from this year. And so how is it that we are still trying to deliver what I call this telegram education to a TikTok generation? So we've got work to do to create an education system that is meaningful, that meets the needs of all kinds of learners. And I think at the end of it, we also need to make sure that parents have options. So whether they are in the public system or the private system, let's create schools that work well for kids.
Alicia, thank you for joining us. That was great.
Thank you for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to that fascinating conversation with Alicia Searcy and for learning along with me more about education and school choice in the public and private areas of education.